So while the Blues Doctor crew is driving currently through the Sioux Indian Reservation in South Dakota, I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of our stays on previous days of this trip. One of which was in Red Wing, Minnesota, which was on the upper Mississippi River. The town, it was interesting. It's sort of an old Midwest manufacturing town that has reinvented itself to some degree as a tourist town. And then the hotel we stayed at was a place called the St. James Hotel, which was also very nice. Maybe the nicest hotel we've stayed at so far this trip. It dated from 1875, but it was renovated early in the 2000s, and they did a very good job with it. It really felt very modern, but they managed to retain the charm of a historic hotel at the same time. And of course, the hotel had its own resident set of ghosts, perhaps the most notable of which was the previous owner of the hotel, or former owner of the hotel, whose name was Clara Lillyblad, I think is how she pronounced it, or they pronounced it. So apparently Clara was very observant during her time at the hotel and went around straightening up behind other employees and picking up stuff off the floors and you know, just kind of checking in to make sure everything was right. Well, apparently now Clara sometimes appears in the dining room and will be seen like picking up silverware off the floor or rearranging things. Sometimes in the rooms in the hotels, people will notice that their clothing has been folded when they get back from being out. Her old rooms in the hotel were rooms 310 and 311. We actually got to stay in 311, which was very nice. You know, we would have rated it as basically like a 4-star or so hotel. However, once again, we saw no evidence of Clara or any other ghosts for that matter. So Red Wing was kind of a cool little town. I can endorse that as a travel destination. Medora itself is a legit old western town. It was founded in the 1880s. And many of the old historic buildings are still present and have been preserved. The hotel, which is called the Rough Riders Hotel, has also been there since the 1880s. And the historic part of it has been renovated and is open and is reported to be haunted. We, of course, stayed in the historic part of the hotel. The ghosts are range from a variety of types, perhaps the most notable being that of children. So it's been reported that people in their rooms in the historic part of the hotel have been wakened by children playing out in the halls at night and were reported to the front desk, only to be informed that there were no children registered in the hotel. And when the guests would go out in the hall, they then wouldn't see anybody. Several things like that. There have been other reports around the hotels too. Actually, the girl working at the desk when we checked out told us her own story. She had been working there about 3 years, and she told us when she first started, she went on her lunch break and was told she could go down in the basement to the employee lounge or whatever it was to eat lunch. She went down there and said the whole time she felt that somebody was watching her and that they were walking back and forth behind her, and that she could even sort of hear the swish of clothing like a dress or something. Anyway, she left early from her lunch break and came back upstairs and told the manager that she didn't want to go back down there again because of that. And the manager said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you, it's haunted down there." So that was a story about the Rough Riders Hotel. You know, Teddy Roosevelt was an interesting guy. Went on to be our 26th president, and not many Americans are that familiar with him today. He was born in 1858 in New York, up on the Hudson, just up from the city, to a wealthy family. However, he was, as they call it, sickly as a child and was asthmatic and had some other disabilities. And he strove to overcome that his whole life. It kind of defined him. He participated in lots of physical activity and wanted to get outdoors his whole life. He eventually did travel out west to North Dakota, to here in Medora, the city of Medora, and founded a ranch here where he lived on and off for several years and engaged in what he called the strenuous life. You know, in a modern era, Teddy might have been a CrossFit trainer or an endurance runner, some sort of extreme endurance event competitor. At any rate, he went hunting, fishing, ranching, so forth in this area, but went back home in the winters to New York. However, that changed when his wife and his mother died on the same day, and that really left him in grief, and he moved here full time to the Badlands of North Dakota and lived for 3 years. He later said that he never would have been president had he not spent the 3 years in the Badlands of North Dakota. It really changed his life. You know, I thought I might talk a little bit more about Teddy after his time in Medora too, to give you some more context. Teddy went back to the east after his 3 years of living on the ranch in North Dakota and became involved in politics. New York State politics first, and eventually national politics to some degree. He became Assistant Secretary of the Navy and was serving in that capacity in 1898 when the Spanish-American War broke out. There had been tensions between Spain and the United States for some time before that, and Teddy had been one of the politicians who had strongly been in favor of pushing all of the European colonies out of the Americas. So very much a Monroe Doctrine guy. So Teddy was excited about the war with the Spanish. Plus, he was probably still compensating to some degree for his description or his reputation as being sickly at some point in his life. You know, he wanted to prove to people that he could go to combat and be in the military, because he had not been, and he took that very seriously. So when the war broke out, he actually resigned his seat as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and entered the Army, joined the Army, with the idea that he was going to raise and develop his own regiment, which he ended up calling the Rough Riders, and the Army allowed him to do that. He recruited people from a very diverse background. He got some of his Ivy League buddies from the Northeast. He got some people from out west, like ranchers and cowboys and so forth. Got some Native Americans, which was unique for the time. He even got some old Confederates who had been his buddies in various places. So it was very much a different unit than the way other American units were made up at the time. So the Rough Riders, with Teddy in command, went to Cuba. They fought in several battles, and probably the most famous was the Battle of San Juan Hill, where Teddy did lead a charge of his men up this very well fortified hill against the Spanish with a casualty rate of something like 20-25%. So there are men dying all around him, but Teddy continued the charge and eventually took the hill. So he was a legitimate war hero. So that after the war, Teddy's star began to rise on a national level. He got involved in national politics. He became vice president to William McKinley, and in turn took over as president when McKinley was assassinated in 1901. Served out the rest of McKinley's term and then won a term of his own in 1904. So Teddy was president from 1901 to 1909, actually. Teddy's presidency was notable for his being so-called trust buster and a friend of the unions, a friend of the working man. That term came in the wake of the Gilded Age in the last part of the 19th century, where the great fortunes of families like the Carnegies and the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers had been made, and it had been sort of capitalism on steroids. Teddy's great insight, I think, was to recognize that, and to recognize that capitalism carried to an extreme could be dangerous. It could incite dissatisfaction among working men or have-nots. And Teddy realized that and used the Supreme Court and other methods to break up some of the trusts that controlled American businesses and to support the unions, and therefore give the working man a little more leverage against the business owners. And I think he was very much a capitalist, but he recognized that capitalism worked best when there was competition between the workers and the owners, and it did and does to this day. Finally, the national park next to Medora is interesting. It's the Teddy Roosevelt National Park, and it's very nice. There are not many visitors to there, and there are probably several reasons for that. Maybe the first of which is it's relatively isolated, but it is very nice. It is on the banks of the Little Missouri River, which have the Badlands that kind of break off above that. It has herds of bison and wild mustangs, which are nice to see, very scenic. However, there's something about it. It's not only is it isolated, but most of the things it has, the beauty of the scenery and the wildlife and so forth, you can find in most of the other western, or many of the other western parks, and usually to a greater extent. Yellowstone, for example, has 10 times the wild buffalo herds, bison herds, that Teddy Roosevelt does, and much more dramatic scenery than Teddy Roosevelt does. So I guess I can see why it's relatively less visited, which may be a good thing. Certainly Yellowstone and Yosemite and Grand Canyon and some of the others are tremendously busy all the time, to the point that during the summers you actually have to make reservations in advance just to go into the park. Not that way at Teddy Roosevelt. So it's certainly worth a trip to if you're in North Dakota.